In 1871, William Seward, President Lincoln's former Secretary of State, visited the city of Jerusalem. And he wrote about that trip to Jerusalem in his memoir, where he recounted his experience spending a Friday night at the Kotel in the year 1871, 77 years before the establishment of the State of Israel. And here's what William Seward wrote in his memoir. They come together at an early hour, old and young, men, women, and little children, the poor and the rich together, discordant as the diverse nations from which they come. And they are attended by their rabbis, each bringing the carefully preserved and elaborately bound text of the book of the Lamentations of Jeremiah, either in their respective languages or in the original Hebrew. For many hours, they pour forth their complaints, reading and reciting the poetic language of the prophet, beating their hands against the wall, and bathing the stones with their kisses and their tears. This coming Monday night, Jews all over the world will observe Tisha B'Av, our national day of mourning, by reciting the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, that very same book that William Seward saw so many people reading at the Kotel in 1871. Eicha is a book attributed to the prophet Jeremiah, who lived and wrote in the 6th century BCE at the time of the destruction of the first temple. And in English, we translate Eicha as Lamentations because that's what the book is. It's 5 poetic chapters lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. But in Hebrew, the word Eicha does not actually mean lament. It actually means how. In fact, 3 of the 5 chapters of the book of Eicha begin with the word how. Eicha, how? How can a city once teeming with life and filled with people now be defined by death and desolation? How can God have cast such a pall of darkness and despair over the Jewish people? How can this most unfathomable of tragedies have possibly happened? And to be perfectly frank with you, most years, the profound theological questions raised by the book of Eicha are not questions which resonate deeply with most modern Jews. Because the 2 primary events we commemorate on Tisha B'Av, the destruction of both the first and second temples, are events which happened thousands of years ago. Most Jews in the year 2024 are not losing sleep wondering how God could have possibly allowed the Babylonians or the Romans to have destroyed Jerusalem. In other words, it's hard to feel genuine grief on Tisha B'Av. And the rabbis of the Talmud understood that psychological reality because they teach that there are 2 categories of mourning. The first category is called Avelut Chadasha, new mourning. Mourning over the death of a family member or a loved one. And it's very easy to feel genuine grief when you're experiencing Avelut Chadasha, new or fresh mourning, because the pain is real. But the second category the rabbis describe is called Avelut Yeshana, ancient mourning. Mourning for the great historic tragedies of the Jewish people. And it's much, much more difficult to relate to Avelut Yeshana, old mourning, because really it's hard to feel genuine grief over something that happened thousands of years ago. And that's why I think we have a 3-week ramp-up period leading up to Tisha B'Av, because we need 3 weeks of pseudo-mourning to help us emotionally prepare for the grief that we should be feeling on Tisha B'Av itself. We need to build ourselves up. But this year is different. Because this year, for the first time that I can remember, certainly in my lifetime, Tisha B'Av is not about Avelut Yeshana. It's not about ancient mourning. This year, Tisha B'Av is about Avelut Chadasha, new mourning. Because this year on Tisha B'Av, we won't really be commemorating the great historic tragedies of the Jewish people. What we'll really be commemorating, of course, is October 7th. A day which will forever be remembered as one of the darkest days in Jewish history. And when we read about the destruction of Jerusalem this year on Tisha B'Av, we won't really be thinking about the destruction of Jerusalem. We'll be thinking about the destruction of Kibbutz Kfar Aza, or Kibbutz Be'eri, or the massacre at the site of the Nova Music Festival. And when we ask Echa, how, we won't really be asking how Jerusalem could have been destroyed thousands of years ago. What we'll be asking is, how can October 7th have possibly happened 75 years after the establishment of the Jewish state? How can our dream of Israel as a safe haven for the Jewish people have been so completely and utterly shattered in a single morning? And most importantly, how can we do everything in our power to ensure that a day like October 7th never happens again? In the final verse of the final chapter of the book of Echa, we read that God has abandoned us, rejected us, raged against us. And I think that's exactly how so many of us have felt since October 7th. But the rabbis could not countenance concluding the book on such a dark and hopeless note, because Jews always need to end everything we do on a note of hope. So when we conclude reading Echa, we read the final verse, and then we go back and we read the penultimate verse a second time, a very famous verse that has become a cornerstone of our weekly Shabbat liturgy, and a verse which can give all of us hope in the midst of interminable darkness. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva, chadesh yameinu kekedem. Turn us towards you, O God, and we shall return. Renew our lives as in days of old. And let us say, Amen. We rise now for the beginning of the Musaf service on page 184, beginning with Chatzi Kaddish.